This is the problem for Russia, where Ukraine has done terribly well with the help of sanctions, is that there is no total air dominance still over this battle line up to, and we're coming up in February to the third anniversary over 3 years. And this is incredible in a way, as indeed is the marine activity of Ukraine. They're using robotics, naval robotics, downed an Mi-8, a hit helicopter the other day, and they're proving remarkably skillful to the extent that 1/3 of their ordnance of this kind is now produced by Ukraine. And Ukraine is a market leader, and it's going to be a very big presence and very difficult to deal with in this department. Now, why isn't Russia winning in the air?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, Robert Fox, who's been a journalist for more than 50 years, during which time he's covered conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East and the Falklands. He's also the author of multiple books and is currently defence editor for the London Standard. Robert, it's always a pleasure. Happy New Year to you. Welcome to Frontline. Wanted to start by getting your sense of where this year is going to take us in the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin used his New Year's address to call 2025 the year of the defender of the fatherland. But do you think this year could actually be a year in which he gets a nasty surprise and realises that Donald Trump is not as pliant to Russia's demands as Putin may hope?
Well, a Happy New Year to everybody, to the viewers, listeners, and you, James. I think it's going to be a very interesting year and possibly much more interesting than 2024, although we did have remarkable shocks, including the collapse of Syria, very much affects Ukraine because, of course, it's another blow to Russia. But it's very interesting. We've got defense of the fatherland, the battle of words, the rhetoric, the information war has got to a fascinating, critical, I think, a tipping point now, a limit of exploitation of one side or another, and what they call in military terms the culminating point. Because to go back to Putin, Lavrov, listen to them, the record hasn't changed, and the record hasn't changed by that in old-fashioned CD or vinyl. They're spinning the same disc, and it's not been affected by the arrival of Trump for a second Trump presidency. It's hardly being considered. Let it be said, in the last 10 days, that both Putin and Lavrov have doubled down, and Lavrov is very much the mouthpiece of the Kremlin regime, in saying that, our terms haven't really changed. We are prepared to talk peace, but we want complete neutrality. By the way, that's where the phraseology has changed a little. They're now talking about Ukraine being guaranteed non-aligned, which is an old-fashioned post-Second World War formula, and nobody knows what this really means. It's saying we don't want them to join NATO, and that should not even be considered right off the board for 20 years, and even more, says Mr. Putin. I think even he cannot invoke Tsarist immortality and live beyond 25 years, at least politically. It's very strange. So we have three things in the terms restated by Russia. Capture of territory, the holding of territory, and a bit more, because they're claiming beyond Donetsk and Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson as well. No Western influence, at least as far as it can be made out. By that, no joining NATO, no joining the EU, and no European buffer force. And finally, point 3, which he's always been on about obsessively since the Maidan uprising in 2014, is denazification. In other words, regime change and the restoration of Putin's puppet to power in Kiev. Those are the terms, and they're not changing. And I doubt very much the way things are configured at the moment that Donald Trump and his team can change those terms. As we go out and as we look to the new Trump presidency, which by the signs of things looks infinitely better prepared than it was 2016 into 2017, his first administration. It's much better prepared this time, but it looks as if he's going to get very, very little traction with Putin, because Putin has a war regime. He lives by the war and dies by the war, and he cannot afford to give up the war at the moment. And that is the pinch point that the Ukrainians are looking to, and we should go into that.
And you do wonder if Trump will end up losing patience with Putin, if Putin is not prepared to compromise. And there may be an element of his demands at the moment that he's reiterating publicly just being brinkmanship. I mean, that is the nature of striking any deal. You set out your demands and then you compromise once you get around the table. But whether he can even get him around the table is an issue. And I know a lot has been made of Trump's previous comments that he could end the war within 24 hours. That clearly isn't going to happen. But then you also get the appointment of people like General Kellogg, as his special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, who has previously said, look, if Putin does not make concessions, we should ramp up military aid for Ukraine. So do you think actually Trump may end up in a more hawkish position when it comes to Ukraine and Russia than many people expect?
Well, he doesn't like Ukraine, and he doesn't like the Ukrainian conflict. So I doubt if he's going to ramp up. He will try to avoid it. I suspect that Keith Kellogg may well be one of the first casualties of this administration, because he'll be changeable about it. But what Trump will want to prove with Putin is that he can best him, that he's regarded Putin in the past as the only leader in the world almost who was up to him in skill. But Putin has been quite open about his contempt for Trump personally in the recent past. So I don't think this is a marriage made in heaven. But it does mean there will be an awful lot for the Europeans, including the British, to do in this, because it seems from what Kirillov Budanov was saying, a very important figure in the way the Ukrainian regime faces out to the world, and we'll name who he is again in a minute. But he is saying they are prepared to go on with the war. They're going to grit in, and they're going to use very different methods. By the way, in the information war and the trolling, Budanov is infinitely more successful than his opposite numbers on the Kremlin side. Lieutenant General is he now, Kirillov Budanov is in charge of psychological warfare, intelligence, propaganda. He plays with everybody. He is brilliant at massaging and manipulating the Western press, and he keeps them guessing. He makes sure, like any good propagandist, that 90% or there's a high percentage of fact, but what he is spinning, a lot of them can't make out. But it's very interesting in his latest public interview for publication and obviously for consumption, not least in Russia, but also in the West, that means Europe and the United States. Kirillov Budanov is betting on Russia getting into real trouble with its economy by the summer. And that looks like being a very interesting point for Putin to navigate. And it could break him, because at the moment, in the simple, crude terms of economy, which is about people, they're just about managing to replace the number of casualties they're recording per month, which globally is roughly, they're losing about 30,000 a month, which is an awful lot. And through recruitment, through veiled mass mobilization, bribery, leaving, a lot of incentives to join up in the Russian forces, that they seem to be managing just about. They're losing far too many. They're losing per square kilometer gained. They're losing colossal number of forces. And I've just looked at the latest calculations. Okay, mostly it's based on figures from Kiev, from the London MOD, and from America. But up to 450,000 casualties have been recorded on the Ukraine front by the Russian forces. That is killed, quite a lowish proportion of that, about a third, I would suspect. But the rest are immobilized. They're so badly injured and damaged that they cannot be rehabilitated and returned to the front. That's a colossal number to be losing. And if they're going to lose at the same rate through the first half of 2025, I think it's going to be very difficult. Now that they are managing to replace, as I was saying, but looking at the figures again, mind you, we don't hear much about the Ukrainian losses because they have been managing brilliant operational security, in other words, secrecy about their losses. But when we come to materiel, that's kit, this is where Russia really is in trouble. There are things that they've ramped up enormously, and we should talk about it in a minute, which is domestic production of drones, particularly Russian versions of the Iranian Shahed drone. But when you look to barrels, by that I mean heavy caliber barrels for tanks and artillery, they're finding it very, very difficult to keep up. And when you look, they've just about hit the 10,000 mark of main battle tanks, that have been lost since February 2022.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and let's explore that. I mean, could this be the year where a lot of these things come to a head for Russia, not just in terms of supply of material, but also you look at the economy in the same way you can't talk about war without talking about politics. You can't talk about politics without talking about economics. And already you're seeing signs of the Russian government being aware of the need to reduce the long-term costs of the war. You've now got them saying they're going to deprive prisoners who volunteer to fight in Ukraine the one-time enlistment bonus. They're clearly worried about some of these escalating costs associated with the war. How sustainable are those costs, and could they come to a head in the next 12 months?
Well, in economic terms, it looks ridiculous in a way that the bank rate has gone up from 21%, possibly up to 23%, but being held for some months through 2024 at around 21%. But there are speculations that it will go to 23%. Inflation is just about heading towards double digits. It's 8.99%. That they're finding it very difficult to trade in foreign currency. And it looks as if the gas and oil, the hydrocarbon economy, is going to be essential. And they're beginning to squeeze it in a way. They are hugely reliant on the shadow fleets, the rather dodgily flagged tankers and freighters, which have a horrible habit of breaking up and causing trouble. And then we've had the shutdown of the trans-Ukrainian gas lines, which is going to affect immediately Slovakia and not so much Hungary, Slovakia and Austria. Let's get this right. And then Czechia, the Czech Republic. But watch who's making quite a big noise about it, and I'd like to have a little exchange with you about it, is Italy, of the major EU partners, that is really, really worried about it. And I'm really concerned about possibly Italy beginning to develop a double game towards the Kremlin. But it is looking bad, and this is where the crucial figure, we hear from her from time to time, and there have been reports that she may even have offered her resignation back in the summer, and it's Elvira Nabiullina, the very astute, trusted by Putin, curiously, governor of the central bank. And she has warned and warned and warned about the difficulties of the economy. Now, look at it. Yes, if it was an economy like Spain or Italy, and the Russian economy is roughly somewhere between those two countries, as far as we can make, there would be real problems. There would be real problems of confidence. Not that there aren't, but it can be concealed, because this is a total command economy run by a dictatorship. So how much this can endure, how much it can cover up, and how much it can operate in complete contempt of its consumers, of its civilian population, which are beginning increasingly to have a miserable time with consumer prices going up, the cost of living. That is the big question. All this is up in the air. But in the end, it is the economy of the battlefield that's going to decide. And on that, we have to look very carefully at where Ukraine wins and where it is vulnerable. And it's in the same sphere. What is going on in the air is simply fascinating, because if you had gone to the think tanks of UK, France, Germany, and America, places like RUSI and the IISS in London, that very estimable, turning out very interesting material. If you'd gone to them, say, in 2020, 2021, they would say this much reformed Russian armed forces, that the Air Force would be totally dominant. This is the problem for Russia, where Ukraine has done terribly well with the help of sanctions, is that there is no total air dominance still over this battle line up to, and we're coming up in February to the third anniversary over 3 years. And this is incredible in a way, as indeed is the marine activity of Ukraine. That they're using robotics, naval robotics, downed an Mi-8, a hit helicopter the other day, and they're proving remarkably skillful to the extent that 1/3 of their ordnance of this kind is now produced by Ukraine. And Ukraine is a market leader, and it's going to be a very big presence and very difficult to deal with in this department. Now, why isn't Russia winning in the air? It's using crude weaponry. It's buying weaponry from wherever it can, getting some assistance from China, but obviously the cozying up to North Korea has had an effect, particularly for artillery ammunition, but there is collusion there on missiles, and we know that we suspect rather, they've been looking at hypersonics. It's whether Ukraine's air defenses can hold out through the winter and keep power going enough to the citizens and civilians. It's very interesting that we're seeing a similar phenomenon in the Middle East, particularly with regard to Gaza and to an extent the West Bank and Lebanon, and in Ukraine, Kursk and so on, is indiscriminate firepower being used against civilian populations. And this will be a long-term legacy, and things will not be allowed to rest there. And it will be Russia, and indeed, it must be said, Israel, will be in the firing line for the long arm of international law convention. They can't enforce much at the moment, but they will find ways, I suspect, within 5 years. So it's going to be decided in the air. Can Ukraine defend enough, and can it keep enough people in the front line? Why isn't Russia, for all these magic new weapons like the Oreshnik missile that was declared, it cannot get dominance so far? And it's even losing the thing which seemed to be a unique, crude weapon, but giving them great advantage, the glide bomb, which was old bombs with new guidance systems so that they could operate like a standoff cruise weapon. They're using them less frequently now. And I think this is where it will be decided. It will be decided to an extent with manpower, it will be decided by air power, and it will be decided by the economy.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Just to go back to Donald Trump, I mean, look, he is a man who sees everything in terms of deals. Is it a good deal for him personally, for America? Is it a bad deal? He was the author, of course, of The Art of the Deal. But when you look at America's relationship with Europe with regards to Ukraine, is it not fair enough to say that he sees that currently as a bad deal for America? Because America is largely bankrolling Ukrainian military aid, certainly to a far greater extent than Ukraine's European allies, and yet it is Europe who is most at threat from Russian expansionism. So if Ukraine's European allies, the UK in particular, but France and Germany and others, maybe Italy and more, if they were to increase the amount of support they were prepared to provide, could that change the way Trump feels about this? Could he start to see this as less of a bad deal for America? And should the Europeans be prepared to take that gambit and increase their military aid?
Well, James, I think you're right, but I think it goes even further than Ukraine, could you believe it, on this. I think when Trump says he wants Europe to pay for Europe's defense, he really means it. And it isn't just bluff and rhetoric and, MAGA and America first. Where he again is right is that America cannot afford to have a full global military deployment. And it is very worried, for very obvious reasons, about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, what China is up to, because the Pacific cockpit is really very, very important. And by the way, their defense, $750 billion, just about their budget, can't cover everything. They too have manpower problems, and they cannot do everything. And if you look at the most sophisticated army market in the world, wonderful Freudian slip there. What does Europe do? Europe, and if I was Trump, and I would be very sympathetic to a discussion with Mr. Volz, the new national security advisor, and Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, and say Europe actually really hasn't got its act together. And the thing is that the three principles are all deeply flawed, which is annoying the very effective second-tier allies, and I'll name them. And they are Germany, which doesn't know whether it wants to vote for an appeasement government when it comes to the polls in February, in the general election there. The totally bifurcated, split governmental system in France, which really weakens the Jupiter stance of President Macron. But at least Macron is one with a real vision about this. And then you get the man in the middle, and I wasn't going to use a more vulgar expression from a nursery rhyme, Mr. Starmer. And Sakir is the man who says, "Oh, I can't decide. I'm in the middle. I don't want to choose between America and Europe." Well, he also doesn't want to choose defence, and that is going to be a huge debate in the UK this coming summer. And I predict it's going to be one of the fiercest things about defence, resilience, security, and homeland protection than there has been, I was about to say, since the end of the Cold War. No, I'll go even further. I think it's going to be the most serious debate since the end of the Second World War, because Starmer has shown himself simply not to be interested, nor has his chief cashier, namely Rachel Reeves. We can't afford it. And if you go round a slack handful of their backbenchers, the new Labour MPs, they will say defence is simply not on our agenda. Well, if there is a cyber attack, an asymmetric attack of various kinds, and by the way, even bioweapons are back in on the agenda. If there is something, if we discover with the resurgence of IS in America and across the Middle East is extremely worrying, and we should be prepared for that. And we know that the intelligence services are stretched, to use the tautology, overstretched. The Ken McCullum of the Home Security Service, in other words, MI5, said we have to choose between subversion, organized crime, and dealing with the Russian threat. Well, he shouldn't. He should be covering the waterfront, because it's an essential element of national protection, which is simply it's as if Starmer seems to be saying, as he said about another matter, which is the demographic change of this country. He said to somebody, an advisor, allegedly, "Why should I be interested in it?" Well, it's the old maxim about defence, an expression I hate, because we've got to look at it in terms of home protection in more sophisticated terms. But as they've always said about defence and politicians, and particularly British politicians, you may not be interested in defence and war, but they are very interested in you.
On Keir Starmer, look, there are lots of things that many people would think he could be doing more of when it comes to support for Ukraine, but he's been Prime Minister now for 6 months. He's been criticised from some quarters for doing too much foreign travel. But why hasn't he visited Ukraine in that time?
Well, that's a very good question, James, because I want to know to what end he pursues this foreign travel agenda. Is he collecting air miles? I don't know whether they do it on the planes that he goes. I just don't know. But I think that he's not coming off very well for this. He visited Tallinn for a meeting of a section of allies which Britain leads, called the Joint Expeditionary Force, now bolted into NATO. And he seemed to have whinged at them, people who are very much on the front line, like the Finns and the Baltic countries. Oh, we can't do that much because it's much worse than we expected. The Tories have left such a mess. And this is why they have reneged on their pledge to raise defence expenditure to 2.5% of GDP. I think the percentage arguments, by the way, are really rather nonsensical. There's a sort of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll element about them in the end. But he is, instead of saying we're going to look at the new reality, the new context in which we're working through the Strategic Defence Review, which was due mid-end February, and now we'll be lucky if we get it by the time of the summer recess in July, August. And that is turning out, from what we hear from the voices coming from those going through the papers and the work, is Rachel Reed, the chief cashier. Rachel from accounts has been saying, no, I want cuts. I want you're in debt, there are cuts. But the reason why a lot of the debts have been incurred because there are things we are likely to need. And that's one terrible mistake that they're making about defence, security and home protection, which we've got to talk about, is what is really required. Because this government, unless it is very, very careful, it's got to change its address, change its approach. It could be accused of negligence of one of its prime responsibilities, which is the defence and protection of its own of the national population. That's a very big one. The other thing where they seem to be, they're briefing out from this defence review that, we can't go for all three armed services. So we're primarily an air and naval power, good old Trafalgar and the Battle of Britain. And so the army is going to suffer. They are failing completely in that case to understand the social offer and the social requirement of numbers of soldiers, of ground forces, of whether they wear uniforms or not that are required in the current context. Anything from disaster relief to second line assistance, if there's a major breakdown, say in the grid and so on, to actually addressing across the population the requirements of the cyber war, because we are falling behind in this very, very badly. And there's a lot on the agenda that's coming up, which, as far as I can make out, the government appears hardly to be discussing at all.
Robert, we could talk for hours. Just to bring this conversation to a close, looking ahead to 2025, how would you rate the chances of there being a ceasefire agreement at some point during the course of the next 12 months?
Where? I mean, in the Middle East, I think the chances in Ukraine are better than in the Middle East, curiously. And if you want to put a number on it, it's 50-50. But I think either way, we're faced with a bad, grumbling war, which Semifredo, as I said, will freeze and then blow up. And it's the blow-ups that are going to be really unpredictable. I mean, there are things where Russia, the Finns and the Estonians are saying, oh, we think that Russia is planning an invasion. I doubt it, because I think that Russia is so worried about the Caucasus. It's losing badly in the Mediterranean, as we have seen in Syria. And that means its interests, which are considerable in Africa, are completely in jeopardy. So I think you're going to get either a muddled peace or a muddled war. I think they will go for some kind of peace, but it'll be a mess. It will barely even be a half-time break in time to even eat the oranges.
Robert Fox, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline. Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.